lot of news coming out about Syria. We're very, very grateful to Jeffery Weiss, who's the director of the Catholic Peace Ministry. He's also an adjunct professor at both DMAT and Grandview. And he's going to be speaking today on understanding the crisis in Syria. Thank you, Jeffery.
Okay. Yeah, it's good to be here. My name is Jeffery Weiss, and I work for Catholic Peace Ministry. We are not part of the Catholic Diocese. We used to be decades ago. I also, as the introduction noted, work part-time teaching in political science and sociology. So I have the task of explaining Syria today. And this is a country, of course, of 23 million people, the Syrian Republic, and Arab Republic, excuse me. And I will try to run through some of the important components of the current crisis, and then try to leave a lot of time for discussion, because I'd rather also hear from what's on your mind. So I'm not a huge fan of PowerPoint, but I do have some slides up here just in case. So some I will make reference to, some I will not. The first thing that I want to note, especially for a United States audience, is the world population has reached 7 billion. And there are 2.3 billion Christians in the world and 1.7 billion Muslims. And at the same time, all Muslims are not Arab. It's always important to point that out to a United States audience. In fact, of the 1.7 billion Muslims in the world, 80% are non-Arab. So the three largest Muslim majority countries in the world are Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. So another common stereotype that people in the United States have is that all Arabs are Muslims. And of course, when we look at Syria, 10% of Syria's population is Christian. Most of those Christians are Arabs, of course. So we also look at Iraq, we look at the Palestinians, and we know that they also have Christian populations, Lebanon, of course. So it's just something I always try to point out. Also, of the 1.7 billion Muslims in the world, 90% are Sunni. And the other 10% are Shia. And so this is an important distinction. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad, the question in Islam was who was going to succeed the Prophet. And Sunnis went with the idea of a caliphate. Shias, that you would go through DNA, and that the last would be son-in-law Ali of the Prophet. And so this is also an important distinction in the world of Islam. So just having gotten that out of the way, this part of the Arab, when we talk about the Arab world, we're talking about the 21 nation states that speak Arabic, of which Syria, of course, is a part. And when we talk about this part of the world, there's definitely a shared history back to the Arab empires. There's a saying in Arab that's often in the Arab-speaking world. The book is written in Beirut. It's published in Cairo, and it's read in Baghdad. There is now what many of us have been reading about the last few years, the so-called Arab Spring. Sometimes I say so-called because with the extensive loss of life, spring just sounds, sometimes it just doesn't sound right. But when we look at the Arab part of the world, we have to understand that these are countries that in particular in the 20th century were colonized. Much of the lines and divisions, especially when we talk about Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, were drawn by the British and the French. And a lot of what is really happening in that part of the world today is a break from the post-colonial structure, a break from the post-colonial governments. I'll talk about that more, especially in the case of Syria. Now, when we talk about Syria, we are looking at, in the last 21 months, 40,000 deaths. The International Committee of the Red Cross has stated that this is officially a civil war. What that means in international law is that international humanitarian law is in place. That means that the Bashar Assad and the military forces in Syria and the opposition, the Free Syrian Army, and all the different rebel groups, they are instructed to follow the Geneva and the Hague Conventions. This is, according to international law, a civil war that is taking place. Loss of life, 40,000 deaths, a lot of different estimates about whether the number of civilians is anywhere from 50 to 60 to 70%. There's vastly different numbers that you can look at for that. Hundreds of thousands of refugees in neighboring countries. I'm sure you're reading about all of this in terms of the humanitarian crisis. The opposition often gains territory in the major cities. The largest city in Syria is Aleppo, 2.9 million people. Damascus, the capital city, 2.5 million. And Syria itself is bordered by Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan. In particular, Turkey has the high ground. The Israelis have the high ground with the occupation of the Golan Heights since 1967. Of course, 80% of Syria's people live, if you draw a line from Damascus to Aleppo, live on the western side of the country. 80% live on the western side of that particular line. And in a population of 23 million people, in a country that is roughly the size of North Dakota, that is where most of the 40,000 deaths have taken place. Now, what is the Arab Spring? Back to that question. There's an Arab saying, better 100 years of tyranny than one day of chaos. Well, it's possible that many of the countries where there have been uprisings, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, now of course Bahrain and Syria are in major turmoil. For perhaps decades, this was true. The Arab-speaking world is now asking whether they will continue to be subjects of governments that have been run, for example, in Syria, by the Assad family, by the Ba'ath Party, by the Alawites, from 1970 up until 2012. And this arrival of chaos is now the situation in Syria, despite that old saying. We are tired of being subjects, we demand to be citizens, is a cry often from the Syrian opposition. What is being challenged in this part of the world is the long rule, Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, of the executive branch, of family rule, of presidential, not elections, but referendums where Assad gets 99% of the vote. Article 8 of the Constitution of Syria, which Assad amended months ago in an attempt to placate the opposition, stated that the Ba'ath Party is the party of Syria and would remain the party of Syria. There would be no opposition party. Assad did amend that, but to no or little effect from the opposition. So much of what is happening in Syria in this part of the world is a struggle for identity. With nationalism, we say that nationalism is devotion to one nation superior to the interests of other nations. But Syrians are asking themselves many questions right now. Are we first and foremost Syrians? Are we first and foremost Arabs? Are we first and foremost Sunni Muslims? Are we first and foremost Shia Islam? What do we identify with? And I'll talk more about that question, because I think that you can talk about Syria and the larger questions in this part of the world by looking at the question of nationalism and also looking at what appears to be an attempt from the masses of the people in Southwest Asia to challenge the post-colonial governments that were put in place largely by the French and the British, and especially the French in the case of Syria. Now, let's look at Syria a little bit closer. 90% of the 23 million speak Arabic. 10% are Kurds. The Kurds are the the largest nationality in the world who does not have a nation state. I also forgot to mention that, of course, Southwest Asia, this part of the world has the Palestinians. The Palestinians are the only people in the world who, according to UN resolutions, have a right to a country of their own. The Chechens don't have it, the Basques in Spain don't have it, and the Kurds don't have it, despite the reality of, 22 million Kurds or more in Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. 22 million, I think that number's even actually a little bit higher. Syria is 75% Sunni Muslim, 11% Alawite. Who are the Alawites? Well, Assad is Alawite. Much of the military and security forces in Syria are also, as is a lot of the government and the people around the Assad family. The Assad family, as I noted, in the Ba'ath Party, the Alawites have been in power. The heads of government and the heads of the military since 1970. The Alawites are a sect of Shia Muslims. They, in fact, recognize Christmas, Easter, several Christian holidays. They are Arab-speaking, okay? So we want to make that distinction when we talk about the Alawites, that they speak Arabic, but they are a sect of Shiism. 11%, as I noted, were Christian, and 4% are Druze. Druze are also another small sect of Shiism. Assad, as we noted, is Alawite, the government, military. 60% of Syria is under age 21. But this is an important component of the Arab Spring. This is a large, unemployed youth population. I was reading some travel books about Syria that were written before this uprising. And some of them were quite prophetic because they wrote about how there's going to be a crisis of employment because we have a growing youth population. Assad started to initiate some privatization schemes around 2008, 2009, which are also key to understanding that have also led to this uprising. As I noted, a population of 23 million. Now let me just say a couple of things about the history. Syria was, I won't go through the long history, of course, you know, Damascus is perhaps the oldest inhabited city in the world. We still have in villages we still have some villages in Syria where Arabic is spoken, which of course was the language of Jesus of Nazareth. And Syria was ruled by the Turks, by the Ottomans up until World War I. It became a French mandate state at that particular time based on the Sykes-Picot Treaty. And this is important to note because after World War I, when the Ottomans were defeated in Southwest Asia, the British took over Transjordan, Palestine, and Iraq, and the French took over Syria and Lebanon. The French ruled Syria from 1920 to 1946. According to the League of Nations Article 25, you were a mandate state until you could stand alone, was the language. France ruled, let me get a map up here again. Let me just real quickly get a map of Syria up here. France, there we go. You can see Syria up here. France ruled Syria similar to how the British ruled Iraq, which was put weapons and political control and political power into the hands of minorities. The British did that with the 20% of the population, which was Sunni Arab, which would become Saddam and the Ba'ath Party when Saddam took power in Iraq in 1979. The French concentrated power in the Druze, the Alawites, and the Christians who lived along, of course, western Syria and a number of key cities there. The carving of what some Syrians call beachfront property, otherwise known as Lebanon. Of course, Lebanon, Transjordan, Israel, all used to be called Greater Syria. All of these were part of Greater Syria. So you can see how the lines were drawn at that time rather arbitrarily. In particular, you can see this with the long relationship between Syria and Lebanon. So I guess we can blame the French for all the problems. I'm joking. But it is important to note in the 1930s and the 1940s that the 75% of the population that was Sunni Arab, and including a lot of the business people in Aleppo and Damascus, they didn't want to join the military. And so the Alawites not only were oftentimes appointed by the French, but they also joined the military and became the officer corps. This, of course, became important when the Ba'ath Party starts to ascend around 1963, and in 1970 when Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, takes power in Syria. So once again, let me just repeat that it's an important component of what is taking place right now, that the post-colonial governments in nearly every one of these countries, Tunisia, Egypt, Iraq's government has been toppled, and the 60% of Iraqis who are Shia Arab are now in power. That this is happening all throughout. 75% of the Sunni Arab population is in an uprising right now against an old order which was in fact set up by the French. What led to the civil war in Syria? Of course, the Arab Spring, first Tunisia, then Egypt, then Libya. In March of 2011, I'm going to get a better shot of Syria up here. In Dara, which is right here, I believe it was March 15, 2011, a number of young people, teenagers and others, started writing graffiti on the walls of the city, down with the regime, Assad has to go. The security forces acted harsh, and teenagers and young people were tortured to death. Some of the, not only descriptions of what the security forces did, but also some of the visuals got out on the internet. You also have a history of when there was an uprising in Syria, 1982, for example. In Hama, the growing Syrian Muslim Brotherhood was involved in the 1970s, a number of strategic, political, and military assassinations against the Assad regime. And an uprising in that particular city in 1982 was brutally put down. It was called the Hama Massacre, and over the course of several months, tens of thousands of people were killed. The shelling, the leveling of villages, and people who were involved. In some sense, that was the precedent, that when Syrians were starting to go out on the streets in 2011, they could harken back to 1982 and were asking themselves, will this regime respond the same way? And in fact, they have. Okay, let me say a couple more things. A few other things I want to say about the background of this particular crisis. Assad put in place around 2009 some privatization schemes in terms of the economy, which may have backfired. One of those was what we often refer to as crony capitalism, which is taking the resources of the state and turning them over to your family and friends. There's a case, for example, where his first cousin was essentially given the then government-run mobile phone company. Also, real estate, tourism, several industries which were publicly owned were privatized in a big privatization scheme. And many of these resources were essentially handed over to friends of Assad and his family and others who were around him. Crony capitalism, I guess, sort of a system of public subsidy and private profit. Another thing that took place with the privatization schemes was the holding back on the subsidies for food. One of the things that we've seen in every one of these countries that has led in part to the uprisings is the expensive food. Anywhere from 30 to 60% of Syrians' budget during those years was spent on food alone of their income. okay? I mean, we are used to pretty cheap food in the United States where we consistently spend less than 10%. So that might be something that's difficult to relate to. But in Syria, and many people say in part because of the privatization and ending the subsidies for food, especially people in Damascus and Aleppo, the larger cities of Syria, were having to spend more money on food. So crony capitalism, sort of a la the Russian Federation, a lot of what we've read about. The other accusation that the opposition made against Bashar around 2009 and 2010 was that a lot of the social safety net that they had lived under was being undercut by some of this privatization. I'm going to say a couple things about Bashar al-Assad. His father, Hafez al-Assad, ruled Syria from 1970 to 2000. And Bashar's older brother, Baza, was probably the favored son who was expected to take over after Hafez passed away. But he died at the age of, I forget what age it was, but it was in 1994. He died in a car crash. So when Hafez al-Assad dies in the year 2000, succession goes to his younger son. Now, Bashar was only 34, so I believe they had to rewrite the constitution because he had to be 39 or above to take the presidency of Syria. He was actually at the age of 34 was sort of a computer freak who was also studying to be an optometrist, an eye doctor in London. He didn't have a lot of political experience. Very good with computers. He actually started the Syrian a national agency, which still exists within the government today. I say that because Bashar has done something that the Egyptians did not do. Right when this uprising started, he opened up the internet. He did the opposite of what Mubarak and Ben Ali tried to do, which is to try to restrict the internet. He opened it wide open. YouTube, Skype, Facebook. Because an infrastructure had already been created within the Syrian government to track. And so there has been Bloomberg's finance magazine, I'm forgetting the name of it. It's quite wonderful. It has a headline story about this last week. It's called Virtual War. It's about the war that's being taken place between Bashar and his security forces and the Free Syrian Army and a lot of the young people who are really good at computers. In fact, some people are saying that this recent 48-hour shutdown was a way for the Syrian government to get more information. It was a way to even track some of these people who are Skyping and stuff even better. So what does that mean? That means that as the internet was freed up, the security forces were able to track and key into Skype, key into Facebook, and start targeted assassinations against a lot of, especially the young people who are really good on their computers. Now, some people who are looking at this have said that it's actually backfired. That opening it wide open, especially in the last 2 years, that perhaps Bashar was overplaying his hand, that maybe he and his people weren't as adept on these computers as the opposition is. Because the opposition is doing the same thing. They're targeting the government forces who are tracking the opposition, and they are using political assassination against them, shooting them dead when they arrive in their Damascus suburb as they walk into their homes. So it's a very interesting article on this magazine. It's called Virtual Wars. And so I think in part because of Bashar Assad's background, the war through information technology has taken on a little bit different dynamic. Now, a couple of other things about Assad. We always say in political science that an army is a nation within a nation. And this was an army which grew, like I said, during colonial days, where the Alawites, the Christians, the 25% of the population that were the minorities were created by the French as a buffer against the 75% Sunni Arab population. Same thing the British did in empowering the 20% of Sunni Arabs in Iraq. I mean, this was the classic colonialism. You create a buffer between yourself and the masses. And if an army is a nation within a nation, the difficult thing about cracking the Syrian government, unlike Libya, unlike Iraq, and unlike all the other countries, is that it is possible that Bashar Assad and the people around him have come to the conclusion that we must all hang together or we will all hang separately. We must all hang together or we will all hang separately. And especially because the violence has reached these heights. And the techniques of the military, which include the use of the Air Force, which include, bombing and leveling villages, the use of tanks in urban areas. And this, in fact, these hard repression against peaceful protests have, in fact, increased the backlash. The Free Syrian Army has been able to capture, at times, parts of Aleppo, the largest city, 3 million, parts of Damascus, the capital city, which is 2.5 million, but usually they end up having to retreat under the bombs of the Air Force and also the heavy tanks. Although, of course, if you're following the news, this dynamic is changing. And there are many people who just think it's a matter of time. It's a matter of time as more and more people in the military and more people who are surrounded by this 42-year family rule start to leave and start to go to London and start to perhaps see the handwriting on the wall. Who backs Assad? This is a very difficult question. Some Christians back Assad. Not all Christians back Assad. 10 to 11% of the population of Syria is Christian. Many of them live along the western coast here. He is backed by the government of Iran. The government of Iran also backs Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah backs Assad. Having said that, it's important to note that Syria was the only country in the Arab-speaking world to back Iran against Iraq in the 8-year war from 1980 to 1988 that ended in a UN-declared ceasefire in December of 1988. So there was a long geostrategic relationship between Syria and Iran. I have to say that because I think our media presents it as, well, the Iranians are Persian, but they're Shia Islam, and so they support their Alawite Shia brothers. That's pretty simplistic. The other thing is the portion of the coast is enjoyed not only by the Iranian Navy, but it's also enjoyed this port by the Russian military, the Russian Federation. So Russia backs Assad and has backed Syria. Russia is opposed to any United Nations intervention in Syria. Strongly opposed. Russia Federation is still upset at the intervention in Libya. The Russian Federation is nervous that if the three-quarter Sunni Arab majority takes power, that there could be religious extremism. The Russian Federation also has, as I noted, a geostrategic relationship with Syria. NPR also reported today, some of you probably heard it, that the Russian Federation also has tens of billions of dollars in trade with Turkey. Turkey, of course, backs the opposition in Syria. And the report from NPR was a pretty good one because it noted that Russia might be softening its position, or softening its support of Assad a little bit at this time, which would be really significant when we talk about the United Nations Security Council. Because even though the United States and NATO countries have been able to impose some economic sanctions on Syria, China and the Russian Federation have not gone for any stronger measures at this point. But so now there's some discussion that if Russian Federation is starting to ease, or starting to not support Assad as much, this could be a key point in this ongoing civil war and the question of how long the Assad family can stay in power. Kurds are, as they are everywhere in the region, uncertain about their current situation and uncertain about their future. So there are Kurds who are part of the opposition, and there are many Kurds who support Assad. It is important to note that the Druze, who are only 4% of the population, of course the Alawites, and the Kurds are nervous about a future Syria. Because if the three-quarter population, the majority population takes power, they're not sure what their status will be in a brand new Syria. Just as Christians are not sure about what their status is going to be in a new Egypt. Just as women are not certain of what their status is going to be in Egypt. A wonderful article in the New Yorker recently on that called The Second Revolution. The other dynamic, of course, is Iraq. The United States is upset because they say that Iraq is allowing Iran to use its airspace to help arm the Syrian military. And of course, Iraq is now allied with Iran. Right? One of the consequences of the invasion of Iraq, as everybody told the Bush administration before it took place, is if the 60% of the Shia Arabs come to power, you'll create a dynamic where Iran will have a lot more power in Iraq, and even a lot more power in that particular region, a lot more power and influence. And that, in fact, is what has came to pass. Now, at the same time, the opposition, the Free Syrian Army, the roughly 50% of the Syrian opposition that belongs to the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, most estimates are about half of the 75% majority in that country belong to the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. They are funded and supported by Saudi Arabia, by Qatar, by a lot of wealthy business people in Damascus and Aleppo. The business community in Syria is divided. Some support Assad and some support the opposition. So I throw that out because if any blanket statements that are made in media about the Druze, the Christians, the Kurds, or even the business community in Syria, I would question. Thomas Friedman in the New York Times wrote, I thought, a pretty good article on Syria on Sunday, where he also talked about how this is a very complex civil war that is going on. And it's difficult to just right away assume that he runs into a Christian businessman in Damascus that he's automatically going to be supporting the opposition. He quoted some business people as saying, well, we don't like Assad, but we are concerned about what could come next in terms of the future government of Syria. So there's a lot of uncertainty right now, which I'm sure you're not surprised about. Let me just end and then open it up and to have a discussion, see what's on your mind, by going back to just briefly this question of identity. And I'll just say from a Western perspective, it's interesting to look at this part of the world because in the 1950s, there was a strong Arab nationalism. This is when the Ba'ath Party comes to power. It's when the Ba'ath Party comes to power in Iraq. It's when the Ba'ath Party comes to power in Syria. The Ba'ath Party is an Arab nationalistic secular party which was actually formed by Christians and Muslims together. The Ba'ath Party in Iraq hated the Ba'ath Party in Syria. Let me note that. And having said that, at that time, the United States and the United Kingdom were opposed to Arab nationalism. You know, Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal, the British, the French, and the Israelis, start to use military force against Egypt. The United States and the Soviet Union say, hey, back off, smaller powers. It's really the time when the United States starts to sort of enter that part of the world. Then you have the Jimmy Carter doctrine where he starts to talk about maybe we need military bases in Southwest Asia, right? And then you have the first U.S. military bases, and then of course that was always bin Laden's main grievance, right, against the United States is presence of U.S. military bases in Saudi Arabia. What's interesting to me about that is the Arab peoples at that time, even though they developed a strong nationalist identity, Syria and Egypt actually joined together, called themselves the United Arab Republic. They were sort of married for 3 years, 1958 to 1961, and then they divorced. There's always been that sort of elusive idea. Even though the Arab League says Assad must go, there's a wonderful scholar, Philip Bettis, who's written a number of books about the United Nations systems, who says that the Arab League can barely even agree on like what to eat for dinner when they get together, or what shape the table should be when they sit down and talk. So even though the Arab League, is saying unanimously right now that Assad must go, there must be some power sharing agreement, but this 42-year family dictatorship needs to step aside. We don't want to assume that the Arab League agrees about everything, because sometimes there's a few things that there is agreement on. So it's important to note also that at times the United States and the United Kingdom have also supported fundamentalism, right? The Afghanistan in the 1980s, what the CIA called the Arab Afghans who fought against the godless communists, and which actually led to sort of the foundation of something called Al-Qaeda. And so there is what I see right now taking place in this part of the world is the people of this region want to write their own history. They no longer believe in the governments that were largely formed by the British and the French. Most of them don't pay a lot of attention to the United States, what U.S. policy is. I think another misnomer we have in the United States, this came up during the presidential debate where these I hesitate to call them journalists, but whatever they call them that ask these presidents questions, would ask them about, how dare you let Mubarak leave power in Egypt? I mean, the assumption meaning that the United States could just snap, and people in these countries will just say, okay, is this what the United States wants? Okay, I guess we want the same thing, and really, the power and the influence, I think, of the Western world is waning, and people in this region of the world are writing their own history. So, all right, let me stop there and leave it open to everybody else, because it's a big topic. Lots of things we can talk about. I hope there's things I didn't forget.
Well,
Yeah.
It seems like this Arab Spring kind of got contagious. Just one country and another. There was a lot of similarities in the U.S. and even the UN couldn't really decide what to do. It was truly an uprising from within. But this has been, in Syria, has been going on so long that I can't figure out where the UN, you mentioned how Russia on the Security Council, where the UN and the U.S. is giving Syria a different treatment than maybe what they did in the earlier uprisings. What do you think is making Syria so unique?
Yeah, so the question is what makes Syria unique, and what makes the reaction of the United States and the UN Security Council to all of these particular countries different? Yeah. And, I'll also reference Bahrain to, in terms of your question, because that was also an NPR report today where the people of Bahrain, who are in an uprising against a minority Sunni Arab monarchy, and they're largely majority Shia Arab, say that the United States has a double standard there because we park the Fifth Fleet. We have the big military base there. In fact, a lot of the calculations that are being made by the Bahraini opposition are based on statements that the United States is making. And so the reaction of the United States to all of these uprisings has been different. With Mubarak, at first it was a little bit of silence, and then maybe we stand behind him, but we're not going to say we do. And then there were so many people in the streets of Tahrir Square that the events themselves were so powerful. So I think part of the answer to your question is, at some point the Obama administration has realized correctly that the United States does not have the power to influence events in these particular countries. And that if the United States becomes vocal, it can in fact be counterproductive. I mean, Iran is of course not an Arab country, but this is another thing that came up over and over during the presidential discussion was, the Obama administration was being accused of not supporting the people on the streets of Iran, who were opposed to Ahmadinejad. Well, what Obama couldn't say on national TV, but I'm sure which was what he was thinking, was if we had come out in support of the opposition, well, what was Ahmadinejad saying to the masses of the Iranians? The opposition is nothing but a bunch of foreigners who are backed by the United States. And so if Obama would have, the Obama administration would have come out and said, we support them, that would have been the best thing that the Obama administration could have done to support Ahmadinejad. Of course, he couldn't say that on national TV because that'd be too complex for the U.S. media to understand, and they'd figure out a way to spin it to have it be incoherent. So I think you have to look at every one of these situations differently. But it does appear that the Obama administration, even though they have helped with material aid, and the United Nations is very busy helping refugees, and the humanitarian crisis is quite serious, I would not guess that the United States will be military involved in Syria. But I could be wrong. I could be wrong. I mean, Libya was largely a French and British operation. The United States lost 0. No members of the military were lost in the Libyan operation. So that was largely a French and British initiative. So yeah, the United States has stood back a little bit in this part of the world.
From what I see is happening, if things stay the same, Assad will eventually leave. But the problem is what happens afterwards. I saw a New York Times article that said some of the Kurds were actually preparing not to fight Assad, they're preparing to fight after Assad is gone.
Yes.
And there's other organizations or groups that might jump in too. Do you see that that's likely to happen?
Yes, I think it is likely. And
Repeating the question.
oh, yeah, the question is about if Assad leaves and if the government of Syria falls and there is a new government, are not Kurds and other minorities preparing to have weapons and to protect themselves against the new order? And there's no doubt that's true. And, talking about how the Kurds' fate is uncertain, there's no doubt. And this process is going to play out for decades. It's going to play out for decades in Syria. It's going to play out for decades in Egypt. And a lot of what's happening is not that much different from what has happened in many post-colonial African governments. The people of this region are trying to rewrite their own governments, rewrite their own political, economic, and social systems, and it's going to take a long time. So the Civil War could end, but I imagine there will be a smaller scale war that would take place. If there is a majority government, let's say the government is structured like Iraq's, which is built more on the United Kingdom model of proportional representation, there will be representation at that point for the Druze and for the Christians, for the Kurds and for the Alawites. But will there be enough? What will be the status of women in the new Syria? And what is the status of women in the new Egypt? It's going to take decades to sort this out. And I think the frame that we don't think about enough in the Western world is that these countries that are having the uprisings there are less than 100 years removed from colonialism. And that what the French and the British imposed, in particular the political and military order, is in fact what is being challenged right now. It is being challenged right now. I mean, these governments were not exactly selected by the masses of the people, but they were imposed, and then for decades and decades, the people of this region were, I don't want to say silent, because you had uprisings, but now things have spun far out of control. And I can't imagine the calculation that Mubarak, Ben Ali, and the Assad family are making. I can't. It seems to me that they don't see the handwriting on the wall, or they haven't seen the handwriting on the wall. But they did see the handwriting on the wall, because all three of them are different rather long answer, but yeah.
One of the do you see a redrawing of the map instead of these old European powers decades ago doing this?
Thomas Friedman wrote that at the end of his New York Times column on Sunday. He said, the lines were drawn by the British and the French. Now this part of the world is redrawing. I think that's too strong. I don't think the lines will be drawn. I mean, the Golan Heights are, according to UN resolutions, Syrians, but Israel captured them in the 1967 war. Israel does not appear to be willing to yield the Golan Heights. I mean, there might be some negotiation.
That was another territory that was drawn by Europeans.
Yes, and Hezbollah has been weakened because of their support for Assad. Hezbollah, the majority of Lebanon, even though the Lebanese don't want to say, are Shia Arabs. It might be 50 or 60%. Hezbollah, quite popular in the Arab-speaking world because of their opposition to Israel. You know, they were formed in 1982 when Israel invaded, and then really fought an 18-year guerrilla war to force Israel out of Lebanon in compliance with UN Security Council resolutions. And Nasrallah has been one of the more popular leaders of the Arab-speaking world. He's really scrambling right now because Hezbollah has been supporting Assad. And it's damaged his credibility considerably. And my reading of Lebanon, my favorite journalist in the world, Robert Fisk, who writes for The Independent and lives in the region, has covered about everything that's happened in the region for the last 30 or 40 years. He doesn't feel as if Lebanon will devolve into a civil war because of what's happening in Syria, or that any of the lines will be redrawn, because he says the Lebanese are just tired of their civil war taught them that it's just simply not going to happen. And actually, without Hezbollah wanting to be a part of it, which they don't, there won't be another civil war in Lebanon. The reason I'm saying that is that to me would be the only way that you could see redrawing the lines. The lines between Syria and Turkey are not going to be redrawn. And Turkey is pretty strong in their support of the opposition. And now talking, you know, Turkey's part of NATO, and then the anti-aircraft missiles that they're talking about. Syria is not going to be redrawing their boundaries with Iraq and with Jordan. So really, I can't imagine that any new lines will in fact be drawn. But you can see the complexity of this because, of course, Turkey has now emerged as a serious political and economic power in this region, just as Iran has post Saddam. I mean, they've benefited enormously from the toppling of the Iraqi government. So I mean, this is a dynamic and changing region. And personally, I don't have sort of a lot of the fears I think that I hear in a lot of Western media about a lot of these changes taking place. I think it's going to take a long time to sort out. But I think, as you can see in Egypt, the people are not wanting to go back to what was before. And even as Mohamed Morsi has made some of these changes in Egypt, you can see that people are out on the street again. And it's going to take a long time, but the people in this region might get what they want. Now, what they want is, of course, the theme of a lot of what I talked about. It's not as clear. And even in Syria, if 50% of the three-quarter majority belongs to the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, then we look at the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, we compare them to the dominant political party in Egypt today, and we see a lot of promising things in terms of civil liberties, in terms of the status of women, and we see other things which are not so promising. So at the same time, I think the youth population, which is connected to information technology, which is connected to the internet, all throughout this particular region, 60% of Syria's population is under 21. 60% of their population is under 21. So, yeah, decades to sort this out for sure.